even like ours, kind of this encouragement or this admonition that Jesus said that his followers will fast. It's kind of assumed. It's not a command. It's not saying, hey, the 40 days before this certain holiday, you will fast. But it's more of a spiritual discipline that God assumes that his people will take up voluntarily out of a devotion and a love for Christ, that we will engage in this. So I want to kind of talk through what the purpose is in fasting, really spiritually and biblically. How do we approach this topic of fasting? Because it's not really a normal thing that we just kind of come upon on our own, but through our discipline spiritually we do. So what's the purpose in fasting? About 5 reasons that we're going to look at today. Number 1 is to seek God in a special way. Maybe it's a time of life, maybe it's a season of life, it's a particular challenge that has come into your life, or maybe your family, or maybe for a friend, just something. Maybe it's in a whole community of believers are challenged with, something that they want to seek God in a special way. Some examples that are in your notes in 1 Samuel 7, the whole nation of Israel fasts for an entire day to repent and to receive deliverance from the Philistines. In Nehemiah 1:4, Nehemiah mourns and fasts for days once he hears of the tore down and defenseless condition of Jerusalem. And he fasts and he confesses sin. And then in Acts 13, the prophets and teachers in Antioch, they fasted before they set apart certain men, namely Barnabas and Paul, to be sent out for a special missionary journey. So they fasted and they sought the Lord in a special way. Ezra fasted as part of his request that God provide him with a safe journey. Many times fasting was an expression of sincere and heartfelt repentance from sin and humility before God. It was usually an expression of brokenheartedness and desperation over sin or some danger. And I want to kind of give you a warning here when it comes to, seeing fasting as an opportunity to seek God in a special way, that fasting is not some sort of spiritual manipulation of God to get your way. Okay? It's not like that. Let me just give you maybe a scenario that someone may fast. Maybe there's an opportunity that presents itself to you. Maybe it's a promotion at work or something, right? This opportunity that presents itself to you, and that would be a great opportunity to fast. But it's not fasting so that you can get God to make that opportunity turn out how you really want it. Okay? It's not like God's going along, he's got his will about a certain matter, and then, oh wait, he's fasting? Well, that changes everything. I've changed my mind because that person, gave up something for me. And so it's not that God doesn't respond to our seeking, but fasting is not this kind of a pagan ritual that says, okay, if I really show God how serious I am by harming myself in some way, right? And that's exactly what the prophets of Baal did in 1 Kings, I think it was chapter 18, where these false prophets, right, they served a false god, a demon god, and they're out there begging for it was the first god that lit the stuff on fire, right? It was like a showdown of who was the real God. And so these prophets are up there and nothing's happening, and finally they start to cut themselves, and they're self-mutilating and self-injuring themselves, trying to appease this demonic force, trying to manipulate spiritual powers. And see, when we look at fasting as simply like, well, I really want this to happen, so maybe if I fast, then God will say yes. It's not really seeking God's face, it's seeking God's hands. It's seeking God's blessing, not really seeking his face in fasting. And I'm afraid that we set ourselves up for a very disappointing outcome when we approach God in that way. So fasting is really, number 1, it's to seek God in a special way. It's more about God mold me to your will than it is God mold your will to my will. All right? So that's what it is to seek God. And then second, we see through scriptures that oftentimes we fast to intensify and focus our spiritual hunger. you remember the last time you were spiritually hungry? That's probably even a term that's kind of an unusual term. I don't even remember ever saying that term before in the context of preaching, but have you ever been spiritually hungry where you just wanted more of God? Do you know what that's like? I mean, because our relationship with God is not about just a bunch of rules. It's not about, hey, well, I have to fast. I have to do this. I have to go through these things to make God happy with me. We have a relationship with God. Have you ever missed someone? Maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's a child, have you ever missed someone so much that you can remember just almost feeling sick about it? And I remember one time I was away at a youth camp, and one of our children were very, very young. It was Emma when we moved here, and I was at a youth camp in Estes Park, and I remember that Amy was going to come up and see us for one of the nights. It was towards the end of the week, and we had this emotional and relational. I just couldn't wait for her to get there. And we didn't have cell service in that part of the mountain, so I couldn't just call, where are you? And I remember just kind of sitting there waiting, just kind of looking down the road, thinking, and when do I get to see the woman I love? Man, I had just felt sick about it. It's not even Valentine's Day, and I just did a really pretty, guys, that was smooth. Can that count for next Valentine's? Can I just bank that? I'm wondering if I can. But like if you've ever just been you've just hungered for relation, you've just wanted to see that person or hear from them or hug them just so much that there was like a heartache there. And when we think about fasting, okay, and you know, generally it's food, but we'll talk about other ways that we can do that. You know, it's to intentionally set aside something that's good, and in us that creates this physical hunger that we can use to direct our attention. Man, I'm hungry. What if I hungered for God like I hunger for food? You know, we live in a society, we eat a lot, right? I mean, we think of hunger as that little tinge, right, that we get, you know, 4 or 5 hours, you know, after we've eaten, the kind is like, man, I'd like to eat again. In our culture, most of us don't experience like severe like hunger. We normally never let ourselves get to that point. And so when we think about it in a spiritual focus, that when we allow that hunger to kind of creep into our life and we don't have to just go out and just get something, and we live in a society where we have such abundance of resources that rarely are we unable to go and get something to satisfy a hunger. But when we set that aside and we focus that on God and we think, man, I'm hungry. Man, I haven't eaten in a while. How long has it been since I prayed? What if I hungered for God? What if every 4 hours, if I hadn't talked to God, something inside of me would ache? How would that change my life? How would that change my spiritual focus on things that really matter? I love what Psalm 42 says, and the psalmist here has just a beautiful way of putting this. As the deer longs for streams of water, so I long for you, O God. I thirst for God, the living God. When can I go and stand before him? John Piper said that a Christian fasting at its root is the hunger of a homesickness for God. You know, it's not trying to think of everything in the world as bad. It's just trying to understand how good God truly is and how glorious the future that he has for us is. And so it's simply something that just kind of makes us understand really the priority of everything down here. Fasting intensifies and focuses our spiritual hunger. The third thing that we see is that fasting helps us to control and discipline our flesh, our physical, natural desires. You see, an author, Richard Foster, said that more than any other single discipline, fasting reveals the things that control us. Fasting reveals the things that control us. And I think food in our culture particularly is one of those dynamics that tends to control, that tends to be something that dominates our thoughts and sometimes our lifestyle and sometimes our habits. 2 Peter 2:19 says that you are a slave to whatever controls you. Whatever. I mean, the context here is application is broad. If you're controlled by your anger, you are a slave to your anger. If you're controlled by your jealousy, you are a slave to your jealousy. If you are controlled by your physical appetites, you are a slave to your physical appetites. And that's kind of the way that our physical appetites work, no matter what area of life it is. It could be food, could be sexual desires, it could be money, all these different things. These desires, right? They start out as something that we start to seek after, and it ends up being something we end up serving. We end up being a slave to that thing that promised us pleasure, or promised us comfort, or promised us so many things, and we end up being a slave to it. The great theologian R.J. the raccoon in Over the Hedge, he said, "We animals eat to live. Those humans live to eat." They're controlled by their desire for food. I remember the first time that this kind of shows how old I am. I remember the first time I saw a cooking show on TV. They didn't always have cooking shows on TV. That's something more recent. Like, cooking was always something that, if you went out to a restaurant, you paid someone else to cook. Like, that was kind of the point of it, because it was just a chore. And now, I remember walking in somewhere, I think my wife was watching a cooking show, and I'm just like, a show about cooking? That'll never catch on. That's dumb. I mean, cooking food is not entertainment. That's just a necessity, that they cook food so that people can eat it and live and, taste yummy and all that good stuff. That's never going to catch on. I mean, how many cooking shows are there now? And I have to admit, we actually really enjoy watching one particular cooking show, right? So I kind of have to confess that. But it's become entertainment. It's become pastime. It's become something that has more entertainment value even than, in some cases, nutritional value. And I'm not trying to, boo-hoo on all of that, or on healthy eating, or on all that. That's fantastic. But when we think about disciplining ourselves, about controlling ourselves physically, the Bible has a lot to say. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9:27, Paul says, "I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified." Paul recognized our physical desires have to be controlled. In 1 Corinthians, I already read that. In other places in Scripture, self-control is not just listed as something that's good, but something that's necessary. It's one of the qualities of spiritual leadership listed in 1 Timothy 3:2. Do you realize that in Galatians 5, it's one of the fruits of the Spirit? That quite literally, one of the signs that you are a child of God and that God's Spirit lives in you is that God's Holy Spirit produces in you self-control. Self-control. It's one of the fruits of the Spirit. And it's one of the reasons why I think that as Christians, as followers of Christ, that we should seriously consider fasting, maybe not just once a year as part of some holiday, but as a regular or semi-regular thing in our lives to help us walk a life of self-discipline. Because we need self-discipline in a lot of areas, not just with food. So we see self-discipline was a third motive or third reason. The fourth reason that I find in Scripture to fast is to purify our motives. To purify our motives. Some people fast strictly for religious duty. And that's one reason that I don't support a Lenten fast necessarily. Not saying that there's anything wrong with it, but as an organization or as a body of believers, I don't support like a church-wide necessarily kind of required fast, because that's really out of duty. It's kind of something that's missing the mark in having pure motives. In Luke, in chapter 18, verse 12, one of the Pharisees, which are basically like Jesus's arch rivals when it comes to truth about God and about really following God, the Pharisee is saying, I fast twice a week, which in that culture, it was standard for Pharisees to fast. I think it was Monday, Thursday. I don't remember offhand, but I think it was at least twice a week, and they had to do it. And when they did it, they could kind of puff up and say, I fast twice a week. He goes on to say, I give a tenth of my income. And in this whole context of Luke 18, this Pharisee is simply boasting about why he's such a better follower of Jesus than the sinful guy that was over here. That couldn't even lift up his head because he was shamed by his mistakes he's made. And this guy, in contrast, says, I fast twice a week. Jesus said in Matthew 6, verses 16 and 18, and these are the very clearest instructions from Christ of how we are to engage in fasting. And he says in verse 16 in Matthew 6, when you fast, he didn't say if you fast, he said, and when you fast, don't make it obvious as the hypocrites do. He's talking about the Pharisee. For they try to look miserable and disheveled, so people will admire them for their fasting. I tell you the truth, that is the only reward they will ever get. But when you fast, comb your hair and wash your face, then no one will notice that you are fasting except your Father who knows what you do in private. And your Father who sees everything will reward you. Fasting is a discipline that will purify our motives. And certainly if you fast from food or from other things, there's certain people in your life that you probably need to let know. You need to let your spouse know. You need to let those that may be affected by your fast know if you're going to be on a fast, just so that their lives aren't thrown in a mess. But it's not something that you do to just, I'm so hungry because I've been fasting. I'm so spiritual. It's not that thing. Jesus said, okay, that's your reward. You got it. You're seeking the praise of man. Well, that's all the praise that you get. That's all the benefit that you're going to receive from your fasting when you do it in that way. And so it purifies our motives. And I think on a couple of other side notes with this, and even thinking of corporately or having definite fasts that people are kind of required to participate or strongly encouraged to participate in a specific thing, there's a danger in that we would enter into those types of things simply to kind of make someone else happy or to meet someone else's standards or convictions about a certain thing. And Paul very clearly addresses that in Colossians chapter 2, and it's in your notes. Verse 16, it says, don't let anyone condemn you for what you eat or drink, or for not celebrating certain holy days or new moon ceremonies or Sabbaths. We'll come back to this next week. For these rules are only shadows of the reality to come, and Christ himself is that reality. Don't let anyone condemn you by insisting on pious self-denial. Then in verse 23, these rules may seem wise because they require strong devotion, pious self-denial, and severe bodily discipline, but they provide no help in conquering a person's evil desires. Now, I don't believe Paul here is saying, hey, don't do anything, that requires discipline and self-denial. He's not saying don't. He's just saying don't follow the rules of men who insist, oh, well, brother, I've given up this, let me tell you. And if you love Jesus, you should do that too. Kind of like that Facebook thing, if you love Jesus, you'll share. I got to admit, I don't share. I hope God forgives me, through Christ's blood, that's forgiven, I'm sure. But living to other people's standards or conscience is what Paul is addressing. He's not saying don't do anything that requires severe discipline or self-control. Paul encourages that throughout his letters. He does. He's just saying, hey, if someone has this rule that, hey, listen, if you do this, you'll achieve this standing. You'll bump yourself up, right? In our eyes, maybe in God's eyes, maybe you really are seeking some prosperity. Well, the way to get that prosperity is that you do this. And that sounds a lot like what we hear on TV from a lot of people. And that's not biblical. It's not God's way. And so these rules may seem wise, but they provide no help in conquering a person's evil desires when we're going about it just to satisfy the rules of men. So it's to help us purify our motives. And then lastly, the last real purpose that I want to kind of bring to light why we as followers of Christ should embrace fasting is to prioritize the eternal over the temporary. The eternal over the temporary. You know, when you really think about food, what's more temporary than food? I mean, if I served you up the most incredible meal that you could imagine today, and you ate your fill of it, I mean, you ate until literally you could eat no more. What condition would you find yourself in tomorrow? The rest of the day, today you'd be sick, but tomorrow, what would happen? Oh, I'm hungry again. I'm hungry again. That was a great meal yesterday, but it didn't do anything for me the next day. And so food by nature is the most temporary, right, of all things, right? Jesus even said in Matthew 15:17, anything you eat passes through the stomach, goes into the sewer. His context wasn't fasting in this talk, but he's talking about what defiles a person isn't what goes into their mouth, it's what comes out of their mouth with their words and their thoughts and their attitude. And so we see that food particularly, or really any physical pleasure that we decide to abstain from for a while to focus on God, it helps us to prioritize the eternal by going through a little temporary discomfort. Colossians chapter 3, verse 1, Paul says, since you have been raised to new life with Christ, set your sights on the realities of heaven, where Christ sits in the place of honor at God's right hand. Think about the things of heaven, not the things of earth, for you died to this life, and your real life is hidden with Christ in God. Again, in 2 Corinthians 4, verses 17 and 18, for this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. You know what fasting does? It kind of creates this discomfort. It creates this hunger pain in us. And it kind of helps us remember, okay, you know what? Yeah, I'm gonna satisfy this eventually. This isn't permanent. I'm gonna get to eat again. I'm gonna get to enjoy whatever it is that I'm putting off again. But all these things are temporary. And it helps us focus on those things that are eternal and that have eternal value. You know what? It's not going to matter 100 years from now, probably 99% of what occupies our attentions and our concerns and our anxieties and our worries right now. The kind of car you drive, it's not going to be worth anything in 100 years, most likely. The house you live in might be worth something, but you're not going to enjoy it in 100 years from now. The clothes you wear, the relationships that we enjoy right now, 100 years from today, most likely will not exist. The only thing that's going to exist is a reality of people who have been made in God's image, as his image bearers, having an eternal soul. I like the way that C.S. Lewis put it. He said that it's not that you are a body and you have a soul. It's that you are a soul and you have a body. And that body is temporary. As many in this room can attest to, as you get older and the fragile nature of our human body becomes more and more a reality. And so more and more as we get up in years, we start to look more towards our heavenly home than we ever did when we were younger, because we're being confronted with the reality that this is temporary. All of this is temporary. And we're tasked as stewards to take care of this, but this does not inherit heaven. 1 Corinthians 15 really tells us about what's material, what's physical cannot inherit what's spiritual and immaterial. But our souls do. And so as we kind of discipline ourselves and we go through periods of discomfort physically, it helps prompt and helps us focus our energies on the reality that the only thing that's going to matter 100 years from now is who's in heaven with you. And that's really it. That's really it. And so we have this change of perspective that while, hey, earthly thing, God has blessed us and given us many things to enjoy on earth, and you shouldn't feel bad for enjoying them, but you should not enjoy what's temporary at the expense of what's eternal. Instead, God has given us these temporary things, including our bodies and our time on earth, to be used to share the good news that Jesus Christ, God's own Son, was sent from heaven to live a perfect life as a human and to die a sinner's death on the cross in our place. And that the only way that a mortal man or a woman gets to enjoy eternity in heaven with Christ is acknowledging, I am a sinner. I deserve God's judgment, but I believe and I trust that Jesus Christ took my punishment on himself. He satisfied God's judgment against me, and that when I place my faith and trust in him as my Lord, as my leader, my boss, my forgiver, that he gives me as his gift of grace and love, salvation and forgiveness. And I become adopted child of God to enjoy my inheritance in heaven forever. That's what matters. A little discomfort here, little hunger, pain here and there, giving up something that normally we enjoy, those don't really matter. But it helps us focus on what does. A man named O. Hallesby said that the purpose of fasting is to loosen to some degree the ties which bind us to the world or material surroundings as a whole, in order that we may concentrate all our spiritual powers upon the unseen and eternal things. I want to kind of wrap up and talk briefly about the illustration that Jesus continued to give about this whole topic as we continue reading in Luke chapter 5 and verse 36 and through 39. It says, Jesus gave them this illustration. No one tears a piece of cloth from a new garment and uses it to patch an old garment. For then the new garment would be ruined and the new patch wouldn't even match the old garment. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, for the new wine would burst the wineskins, spilling the wine and ruining the skins. New wine must be stored in new wineskins. But no one who drinks the old wine seems to want the new wine. The old is just fine, they say. So Jesus gives two object lessons, two analogies to what he just said about fasting, right? And these two illustrations are probably foreign to many of us. How many of you remember patching your jeans, right, as a kid when they got holes in them, right? Not that many hands, kind of a foreign concept, right? Our teenagers today pay extra to buy the jeans with holes already in them. Like, just try to sit down and explain that to someone over 60. It's shoot, to someone over 30, it still doesn't make sense. But I'm not a millennial, all right? I'm sorry. So that concept is kind of foreign, but the dynamic was that, even in my growing up, I remember I'd come in from plant my jeans would have gotten a big hole in the knee, and my mom would then put in a patch on the knee, right? And so that practice was used in Jesus' day. And so what he's saying is that even in that day, there was shrunk and unshrunk material. You know, a new batch of material would not have been shrunken through washing and the different processes, right? So if you took a brand new piece of material and put it on an old garment, when that got washed, then that material would shrink and it would just ruin everything. And then he goes on to illustrate the wineskin approach. And you might be amazed to find out I've never fermented wine myself, right? So I don't know personally, but I've read, right, that when you put wine into these animal skins that were new, that when that wine fermented, that grape juice would ferment and expand. And because that wine skin, that animal skin that was used for that was fresh, it wasn't old and dried up, it would allow it to expand with that fermenting wine. But if you were to put, grape juice into an old wine skin that had already gotten hard over time, that wine would burst the wine skin and it would ruin both the wine and the container. So Jesus' audience would have been very well familiar with both of these things. And really, what's Jesus saying here? I think Jesus is really addressing the human tendency to look at the form that a spiritual discipline may take, and then to make that a concrete form instead of constantly going back to the relationship with the God of the universe that spiritual discipline was intended to connect us with, and to be real and to be impactful and to be full of love and life and joy, even in difficulty. But it's our human tendency then to just kind of make a rule, right? And then say, well, that's the rule. That's what we do. And Jesus, I think more than anything, was really trying to emphasize that when we approach God, and it's good to fast, we should fast. But we do not approach it as a rule. We do not approach it as some hardened, just monotonous, traditional thing that we do as Christians. But it's something to be engaged in intentionally and with love and with joy and fully expecting God to speak to us and to be with us in a special way. So I want our musicians to come up, and we're going to close with a song of response like we normally do, and then we have our announcements offering at the end. But I want to kind of make a few statements about fasting, and there's some articles that are referenced in the notes if you get those online that give just practical tips. And fasting from food isn't for everyone. There's individuals who have dietary concerns or health situations like diabetes that fasting from food could be very, very dangerous for them, for their health. And there's sometimes people fast from other things. We mentioned sexual relations, but what's becoming a popular way for Christians to fast in our culture is social media. It's to say, you know what? I'm struggling to find time to read my Bible, but my Facebook log indicates otherwise. And so for some Christians, maybe it's not food, maybe that's not one of those areas that you're led to fast in, but maybe it's the amount of time you spend on social media. I had a friend of mine here in this church who, he kind of recognized some things that threw off the priority of how he spent his time. And he just said, you know what? I love to read comics and I love to read all those things. And I'm going to make a commitment not to pick one of those up until I've completed all my Bible study for that day. And that's not something that you have to do. It's not a rule. It's not something, a tradition. But I want to challenge each one of us. I ask the question, what have you given up lately for Jesus? And I want to ask you to kind of walk out of here today, and maybe spend this next few minutes during this song that the team is going to lead us through, and maybe we contemplate, God, what are you leading me to give up? Maybe it's not food, maybe it's something entirely different than anything that we've touched on today. But as I seek after God, as I lean into a relationship with God that's real and transformative, What would God lead me to give up so that I might focus on him? And lastly, this morning, if you're in the room today or you're watching online and you would say, Pastor Ken, and you talk about a relationship with God, you talk about a hunger for God. And I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand what any of that means. I want to ask you to simply pray and ask God to impress on your heart in such an unmistakable way to give you the faith to believe that he is real and that he loves you more than you can understand, more than you can fathom. And that he has provided one way for all of humanity to be made right with him, and that's through his son, Jesus Christ. And if you don't have that relationship this morning, I want to ask you to make a prayer and say, God, would you give me the faith to believe? Give me the faith to put my trust, not in any amount of religious things that I could ever do, but simply as a sinner that simply acknowledges, God, I give up. I have no strength on my own. I have no strength on my own. And the song that we're about to sing, it's called Stronger. And the good news is, because you probably fasted and failed, I know I have before. Fasting kind of shows us how strong we are in our self-control. And you probably failed, as I have. And you know what the good news is for all of us? It's not about our strength. It's not about our discipline. It's not about our self-control. It's not about our ability to meet any standard, because we acknowledge we cannot. But God is stronger. Jesus Christ has bore all of our sin. Would you have that faith today? Would you stand as we pray? God, we love you. We know today it's a topic that's it's different. It's not something that's maybe ordinary in our lives, but God, would we seek you in this? Would we become a people, God, that use this practice that you encouraged and that you assumed that would do? God, would we use this, Lord, to really lean into you, to strive after you, to have that spiritual hunger, God, and would you satisfy that? God, would we lean into you today? Would we confess our sin? Would we choose to follow you, to let go of sin? Would we choose to put our faith in you for forgiveness and restoration? Would we walk in love and joy, be committed to be your light, to shine that to others? God, you're so good to us. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen.